Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm making this video as kind of a follow-up with a previous video that I made. And I did the previous video on tariffs. And in the video, I mentioned I made it as kind of a response to a Instagram video that I saw, reel, I guess you call it, from a creator who calls herself a BFF. Um, was it financial BFF? Anyway, and she discussed tariffs, and she gave a very simple explanation. And it was essentially, and she was against them, and I'm not for tariffs. I don't like them, but essentially, she argued that if you impose a tariff on someone, the bottom line is that the consumer ends up paying for the item. So whatever the tariff is, the company doesn't absorb it; the consumer absorbs it. And I mentioned that that was wrong. That's not the way that um, companies that have tariffs imposed on them always react. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they'll pass it on. Especially, but they have to make a financial decision. For instance, let's say that their product costs 80 cents to make and or to sell when they finally end up selling it, and when it arrives with the tariff, now it's 90 cents, and it's going up against items in the market where it's going that are selling for $1. Well, they're still selling for less, so they can pass it on, but they're still cheaper than the other products. So these are the decisions that companies have to make. Um, a lot of times, as I mentioned in my previous video, companies will just absorb the cost. And I mentioned that I work for a company, and they would buy wheat, and the wheat price would go up and down. But we didn't change it every single time that the price went up or down. We kept it the same, and sometimes our margin would be more, sometimes our margin would be less. At one point, the cost was so high that we did not raise our prices. People in the company, especially the executives, took the hit. They took less, they started making less money to be able to stay in business. And that's like the decision that was made. Later on, when the price went down, everyone got their salaries returned back to what they were. Um, and the one of the reasons that I do not like tariffs is the example of what tariffs have done in the past. You know, um, and I mentioned the Smoot-Hawley tariffs back, I believe, in the 30s, which is one of the reasons that some people claim is the cause for the Great Depression. The financial collapse that happened, the stock market crash, happened in 29, but the depression didn't start until the 30s. And that was because of decisions that were made that made things a lot worse, including the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And if you go to Europe, you might notice that there aren't DeSotos there. There aren't Packards in Europe. Even with people that have older cars, like here, we'll see from time to time, we'll see an old Mustang or a Ford Falcon, back cars from the 60s. And then there will be cars from before then, like I said, DeSotos or Chrysler Imperials. And you won't find those cars in Europe. And why not? Because when the tariffs were put on items coming in from Europe, Europe imposed tariffs on us, and so they were just too expensive to sell. I mean, they couldn't sell any of them, so they just said stop selling. And that's one of the purposes of the tariffs is to eliminate the competition. It's just it's too expensive. No one will buy them. We won't send them there. We'll send them somewhere else where they won't charge us a tariff, and we can get a better deal. Selling our stuff. There was something back in the I believe the 90s. Um, called the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. Then there was something subsequently done that was the North of the Mexico, Canada uh, trade deal, something like that. And what they did is that it was free trade, so there were minimal number of fees. I think that at one point there was some complaints because trucks coming into the United States have to meet certain requirements to be safe to drive, or maybe some of the requirements weren't the same that the drivers here had, and so there was some complaints about things like that. But essentially, that there was no tariffs. It was free trade, hence free trade agreement. And what ended up happening is that companies like Honda, Toyota, Mercedes, uh, they built plants in Mexico, Volkswagen, and they hired a bunch of people. And the market is not Mexico. The intent was from the beginning to sell cars in the United States and not pay a tariff. If they were coming from Europe, if they were coming from Asia, there wasn't free trade. There were tariffs. Like there are tariffs now on some Chinese products, and part of it is kind of like to level out the trade. If one country is sending a bunch of stuff and the other one isn't allowed to send stuff back, then the country that's receiving all these items will put tariffs on them. It's like, you want our business? Go ahead, we're going to charge you more. And otherwise, and this is where they'll negotiate. Otherwise, let us sell more stuff in your country, and then they negotiate, better deals. And that's the way that tariffs are normally handled. And if you just impose them and you do it to restrict trade, then yeah, you make things very expensive. And right now, they have there was um, this is February, what is it, the 3rd, and tariffs were imposed against Mexico and Canada. And so people were, flipping out, thinking, oh, now our avocado is going to be more expensive, and our beer is going to be more expensive. But I mean, this was thought out. Let's say that they're imposing tariffs on beer coming in from Mexico. Now, I believe that a lot of these companies that bring in stuff, or like some of these Mexican beers, are bottled and distributed from the United States. They build plants here. That way, they don't have to bring them across the border, and so they wouldn't pay a tariff. But somebody down in Mexico, let's say it was a liquor of a beer that was being made and manufactured in Mexico, if it comes across, then that would have a tariff on it, right? And so it might be more expensive than other beers. But we've got tons of beers here. You want to buy, let's say, Pacifico or Corona from Mexico. They bring them, they put them on the, you still have, Michelob and Coors. I don't know. I don't drink beer, so I don't know what beers are around. Bush, what is it? The other one, Budweiser, right? Those are all, and they'll still be sold. And you say, well, something, I'm not going to spend a little bit extra or extra whatever on the Pacifico. We're just going to get Budweiser, and that's fine. And so that puts more pressure on Mexico, let's say, to negotiate a better deal with the United States. And it appears that today, that was kind of like what was going on, which we knew from the get-go, I believe. But I know that this caught my attention because the Wall Street Journal wrote an article on like the stupidest tariff ever. It's like, well, if you're thinking of it as a tariff, as in your rich BFF, that's her name, the rich BFF. If you're assuming that it's going to work like that, then yes, it's stupid, right? If you have two countries and they're equally sending equal amount of stuff to each other, and you put a tariff on one and then tariff on the other one, and they're going to be, things are more expensive, especially if, let's say that they're bringing stuff into Canada's bringing stuff into the United States. Does Canada import anything to the United States that we don't make here ourselves? And the same thing with Mexico. Does Mexico bring something in here, like say beer or cars, something in here that we don't make ourselves? Well, then if they're bringing stuff in that we don't need, then our people won't buy it. They'll buy the American one, which is kind of like the point of the tariff, is to promote stuff that's here. There can be bad long-term effects. For instance, let's say that we want to sell something and to build get a foothold, let's say in Europe with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and they ended up saying, well, we're just going to buy your car because they're so expensive. There was the freight sending the cars over there, and then the tariff. So they're more expensive. And the other issue that happened was that American cars were just bigger. They were made for these bigger roads, and so in Europe they wanted smaller cars, more economy, and so on. And so that just didn't work for us imposing the tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. It didn't work well for us. But it depends on how you use them, and if they're used, you know, with the intent to negotiate. And I also heard that Ecuador is imposing tariffs on Mexico, and they're doing it as a retaliation. It appears it's a retaliation because um, something about a diplomat that was arrested in an embassy. I don't know which country it was, but so they're using it as retaliation. But you know that's why a lot of countries negotiate free trade agreements or something that makes it the minimal charge, so you can sell more products. You know, I remember hearing that the free trade agreement, that NAFTA, for instance, was a good deal for the United States, and I heard from Mexican companies that it wasn't a good deal for them. You know, and I'm not quite sure. I guess maybe it's the industry, because I was working with furniture companies, and they said it wasn't a good deal for them. But there were tons of stuff coming across the border. You know, there's tons. You know, Mexican products, produce. You know, when you go to the store, you'll see that something, and it comes from Mexico or it comes from Canada. Um, but essentially, we make the stuff here. Then there's very little need, or there's an alternative. And it's like, well, you can buy the more expensive, but the import, or you can just buy the local stuff. And sometimes it's also used to boost up the industries here. But a lot of things come into play. Like, for instance, like I said, if you sell them a bunch of stuff, and they're only bringing, you know, something very small over here, then they can impose tariffs on you. And you've got like tons of stuff that you're selling that you want to get out of the country, and they only have, you know, an item or two. Then they can impose tariffs on you. You can retaliate, but you're sending them a lot more stuff than they're sending to you, and so you're going to be paying a lot more. And then you may want to negotiate, right? It's if you want to do business, but sometimes they're made to as leverage for something else. I know that sometimes you can say, well, you know, we'll impose the tariffs, but they'll go into effect in a year, and in that year we'll negotiate, and maybe you'll start building plants here. It looks like the negotiation that happened here was more on helping the United States protect its border and keeping drugs out. And so they imposed the tariffs. There was a phone call that came in, and then they negotiated sending troops or um, other things. You know, they negotiated they leveraged for something else. Anyway, so you know, in my previous video, I kind of explained the way things were, and it seemed to work that way. I'm not always right, but some of these things, I've had experience with businesses that import and export, and so I know a lot more of this than most people. Something very interesting, and this is kind of a theme, something that I bring up from time to time in conversations that I have, is there were several stories in the news that were about how bad these tariffs were, and including one of them was the Wall Street Journal. But there were other commentators saying, well, "What a dumb thing to do! It's going to make things more expensive, and we're already recovering from high inflation. That might still happen, but it didn't. It kind of went the way that I explained it previously. It went the way that um, I thought it was going to go. Um, those of us that have experience with this, there are a lot of the tariffs are not just like impose a cost and all of a sudden people pay for it. There's a purpose for it. Like I said, it's either to boost up business here, it's to bring factories into here rather than having them being imported, create jobs here. There are smart ways to use them. If you're just doing it to um, raise revenue, just to raise revenue, or you're doing it to keep imports out, then expect the retaliation to happen, right? That's like I said, in Europe, they just imposed tariffs on Smoot-Hawley Act. They imposed tariffs back on us, and there are no American cars in Europe. The ones that you see there are manufactured there. There's Ford of Europe, and they make cars there. And their cars are different than ours. I mean, I don't think that when I've been in Europe and any time I've ever seen a Ford F-150. They have their own little, mini trucks that they have. Some of them are made by Ford. Ford's actually very popular in Europe, but they're manufactured there. And now, um, Europe currently, I believe, imposes tariffs on our products. And so there's been a call to charge tariffs or to impose tariffs on European items. And my guess is that it's going to be for negotiation purposes. The American economy is incredibly strong. They want to sell us stuff, and we have a huge market. We make a lot of stuff, and we can make a lot of stuff that we can use here. But we're big markets for the rest of the world. The technology. I know that at one point, and I'll maybe bring this up in another video. I'm not a union supporter because unions end up killing jobs here. It's kind of like there's like a short-term gain. They'll raise wages and people in working unions, and you'll make fantastic money. But then over time, the product that they're making becomes less competitive, and so companies will say, well, "Fine, we'll build a plant in Mexico. We'll build a plant in your country, and we don't have to pay the salaries that we're paying here and the benefits that we're paying here." And so, for unions, they're on the downturn here, especially for manufacturing. And one of the things I was going to bring up is that no television sets are manufactured in the United States. And we used to have some big manufacturers. I think Zenith, Magnavox, I believe, were both American companies, but they no longer make them. We no longer make them. And so all TV sets are imported from a lot of them from Korea, South Korea, or Japan, or Asia, China, because we kind of killed that industry here. But we could at some point turn that around. We could start plants here, and as unions have been declining, you could start them off with, or they could negotiate for lower benefits, but more job security, and then they could start manufacturing television sets here, let's say. I think that not long ago, I don't know how many years ago, but Boeing moved out of Seattle because the unions just demanded that so much for their employees that they moved, I think, somewhere in the Midwest, like Kansas or Oklahoma or Tennessee, somewhere in there. Because they don't have the same, the unions weren't as strong there, and so people would go to work for less, but the company was profitable, and so they ended up working. Anyway, that's the end of my video. Hit the like button. Like button helps me a lot. Subscribe and ring the bell so you can get the any new videos. And I'll see you later. Bye bye.